You can begin.
All right, Rick, thank you very much, and thank you all for attending. We're going to talk about the topic here about coal. We're going to talk about the situation in ERCOT. We're going to talk about what changes there are in this industry. And it is a real interesting time in the electric industry. We've either got a war on coal or an emphasis on emissions, depending on your view. Beside that, we've got the shale gas boom, which seems to be continuing and very successfully. And then we've got an explosion of renewables, especially wind, but also solar. So we're going to talk about these issues and provide some perspective on the reduction in coal generation, as well as the sources that are likely to replace it. And along the way, we'll look at the capacity situation in ERCOT to see if an acute shortage still exists, and there has been an acute shortage rumored or talked about for the last several years. And finally, I'm going to once again review a couple of slides on the solar potential in ERCOT because I think they're simply remarkable. So with that, we'll move on to well, this is what we're going to talk about. I apologize. There's the agenda. We'll move on to the first item. In talking about the environmental issues facing coal, or the reason that coal is becoming more of a challenge, there are about 5 different EPA-instituted regulations, either proposed or instituted regulations, that present real challenges for all forms of fossil generation, but particularly for coal. This slide lists these regulations, and we're going to go through them in a little bit more detail before looking at their impact on generation resources. And the way they're laid out on this slide is essentially the order in which they have been either instituted by the Environmental Protection Agency or proposed. The first is the Clean Air Interstate Rule, or CAIR. This rule was effective in 2005, the current rule, under the Clean Air Act, which was passed by Congress in 1970. We've been operating under this rule since 2005, and the rule was designed to regulate nitrogen oxides, or NOx, and sulfur dioxide, or SO2 emissions originating in one state, but adversely affecting air quality in other states. And the intent was to reduce this drift of sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides 65% below 2003 levels by 2015. So there were some long-term goals in CAIR. CAIR operates by phasing in increasingly stringent allowance caps, but it provides flexibility for utilities to either produce if they have excess emission controls, or consume allowances if they don't have enough emission controls, depending on their circumstances and depending on the economics. These allowances are traded. They're traded on open markets and are valued based simply upon supply and demand, like most markets are. SO2 allowance prices peaked at about $1,600 per ton shortly after the introduction of CAIR, but fell to about $2 a ton in 2011. And by 2013, the prices were under $1. These are the states covered by the Clean Air Interstate Rule, and you can see that this is really an eastern United States issue. Obviously, the largest population density is in the eastern part of the U.S., upper Midwest and eastern, and that's where a lot of the older, smaller coal units are, and many of these have limited or no pollution controls. The West, on the other hand, has less population, obviously, but fewer coal units, and these coal units are typically larger, and they're mainly in Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and Idaho, where a larger amount of these states' electricity resources are coal. So it's an eastern U.S. Issue primarily. Now, the cross-state air pollution rule, the next rule in the list, was designed to replace the CAIR, and it addresses power plant pollution drift between states. Basically the same thing that CAIR was designed to do, but it does it in a very different way. Again, it's to limit the nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide from power plants, and not only from coal plants, but from natural gas and oil-fired plants. And it would require more than 1,000 coal, natural gas, and oil-fired plants in 28 states in the eastern half of the U.S. again to reduce these emissions and NOx and SO2 via a very, very limited cap-and-trade program for emission allowances. The Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or CSAPR as it's commonly called, was revised a couple of times in 2011 and was vacated by the D.C. Circuit Court in August of 2012. The court ruled 2-1 that the EPA had overstepped its authority under the Clean Air Act. Almost 2 years later, and by the way, when CAIR was vacated, when the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or CSAPR, was vacated, we reverted back to CAIR, which is what we are under currently. Almost 2 years later, in April 2014, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed the D.C. Circuit and remanded the issue back to the D.C. Circuit, where it sits today. In the Supreme Court's 6-2 ruling to reverse the D.C. Circuit, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg quoted the Bible. John 3:8, King James Version, I'm going to read. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh and whither it goeth. Now, another translation for that is, the wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it's going. So that passage illustrates the difficulty in precisely measuring the impact of specific upwind power plant emissions on any other state, any other surrounding or remote state for that matter. If reinstated by the EPA, the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule could cause a loss of significant capacity in Texas. But again, it's not been reinstated. Let's look at the states that are affected. Again, it's an eastern U.S. issue. So as with the Cross-State or the CAIR, most of the states are in the eastern half of the country. Texas was not included in the originally proposed Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, but appeared all of a sudden in the final rule. The inclusion of Texas was based on a single theoretical receptor in Illinois. That is, that receptor was calculated to receive emissions from Texas up in Illinois, and allowed the EPA to increase the estimate for SO2 and NOx reduction via the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule by 25%. So the addition of Texas in the rule was very important in the way the EPA justified the rule and how effective it would be. The lack of an opportunity to comment on the rule, particularly because Texas was not included in the original proposal, was the base, at least part of the basis for the legal challenge in the circuit court that resulted in the stay, or in the remand. The states with the most coal generation are clearly evident in this map. You can see in the east, essentially from the Mississippi and a little bit west of that, but the Mississippi east. The green, by the way, is if you can't read the little notations below, the green, those states are regulated for sulfur dioxide, annual nitrous oxides, and seasonal nitrous oxides. The blue are just regulated for annual NOx and sulfur dioxide. The yellow and tan states, or yellow or tan depending on what your computer screen looks like, those are just regulated for nitrous oxides, no SO2. And the gray states are not regulated at all by the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule. Okay, so on to the next rule. We're getting a little bit more difficult to meet as we go. This is the rule here is the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard, or MATS, or Utility MACT, it's called in some places. It was originally issued in December of 2011, but it's been reconsidered twice by the EPA, updated twice by the EPA, and reopened for additional comments at least twice by the EPA. The effective date of the rule was April 2012, and units are allowed 3 years to comply. So that would be April of 2015, just right around the corner. An additional year can be granted if needed, and the EPA has indicated that the additional year would be liberally allowed. And so while all coal and oil units will have to meet the emission limits under MATS, about 40% of the fleet, or 1,400 units nationwide, are going to require some modification or will have to be retired because they can't meet the rule. MATS, again, regulates the emission. It regulates different things. In this case, it regulates the emissions of mercury, particulate matter, and acid gases. And the proxy for acid gases is hydrogen chloride. There are a lot of acid gases, but hydrogen chloride is the one they measure. And just as an aside, Mercury the mercury emissions are very small compared to other emissions. The EPA and others feel they're very dangerous, and they, to some extent, depending on where they go, they are. But these plants emit very, very little mercury on an absolute basis, so it's very difficult to measure mercury emissions. However, the technology is there to measure it fairly closely, and a lot of units do already have mercury controls. The next, and this is a newer rule. This is part of limiting global warming. In the latest EPA initiatives, these next two, we're going to talk about target global warming via the regulation of CO2 or carbon from both new and existing boilers. This particular slide is new boilers, new power plants. The U.S. Supreme Court has already ruled that the EPA can limit carbon dioxide or carbon under the authority of the Clean Air Act, but they can't limit CO2 from sources that don't emit other pollutants covered by the Clean Air Act. Now, it may be confusing, but let me just reiterate that a little bit. If a power plant is being regulated for mercury or for nitrous oxides or for SO2 or for some other pollutant that's covered by the Clean Air Act, then it can be regulated for CO2 as well. But if it's not regulated for any of those others, it cannot be regulated for CO2. There's a very complicated reason for that, not real complicated, but a long explanation. I won't bore you with it, but there is some limitation, and you may read that someplace that the EPA has been limited by the Supreme Court. It's a very narrow limitation and really doesn't affect the utility industry very much. But clearly this rule is going to be difficult for coal plants to meet. You can see that a typical coal plant will put out about 2,000 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, whereas the regulation for those plants is going to be about 1,100. In other words, they're going to roughly have to cut their CO2 emissions in half, a very difficult thing to do. Utility gas boilers are conventional boilers, and there are fewer and fewer of those all the time, but there are some out there. It's going to be somewhat of a problem for them. Even though they're natural gas, they're not coal. Natural gas combined cycle units, which are very efficient, should be able to meet the standard without any additional modifications. So this is going to be difficult, especially for coal plants. The removal of CO2 from coal plant exhaust is largely an unproven technology on a large scale. Now, there are plants that are in early stages, either early stages of operation or under construction that are trying to do this, but it's not a widespread technology. So it's largely unproven. By the way, there are very few new coal plants that are being proposed because they would have to meet these stringent requirements. And the only ones that are currently proposed are those that have this essentially experimental CO2 capture and sequestration system attached to them. Very expensive and, again, typically unproven or generally unproven. So that's the carbon pollution standard for new plants. This is the carbon pollution standard for existing plants, which is reasonably problematic, even more so than the new plant technology or new plant rule. It's significantly different in the way it operates from the new power plant standard. In this case, goals are established for each state, and it's a complicated formula for doing so, but they're based on estimates of the potential in each state for efficiency improvements, for utilization of cleaner generation, and on a power to pollution ratio, or really pollution to power ratio, for the existing units in the state. And once established, once these limits are established, the state has the flexibility to determine how to meet the goals, but the state plan must be approved by the EPA. So it's sort of almost a two-edged sword. The EPA says, well, you have flexibility to do this any way you want, but on the other hand, the EPA has to approve the plan, so maybe there isn't as much flexibility as advertised. But using this methodology, the EPA estimates that carbon emissions in the U.S. will be 30% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. Well, this rule is currently a proposal and has not been finalized, and it's likely that the final rule will be different, perhaps significantly different. It's also likely to be delayed. The litigation around this rule has already begun. A number of states are suing the EPA over this rule, and while the Supreme Court has ruled that the EPA has the authority to regulate CO2 under the Clean Air Act, there are sure to be other challenges to the EPA's authority that could wind their way back to the courts. So the debate is going to be a spirited one, and it's going to take place in the public, and it's going to take place in the courts. One other aspect I want to show you is the way these reductions are spread among states. Again, the calculation is based not only on how much coal production or how much CO2 production is in each state, but what opportunity that state has to reduce them, either through renewables or through demand-side management or any other means to reduce them. They have some flexibility there. But the limits are set for each state. And so this map shows the EPA estimates of the change in CO2 emissions, CO2 emission rates for each state from or between 2012 and 2030. So this is how much the EPA estimates, based on their methodology, that CO2 would be reduced. The lightest colors are the smallest changes, which would be about somewhere between 11 and 20%, while the changes in red are very large, 51 to 72%. Our home state here, Texas, comes in at 39%, which is a pretty hefty number, and that's because we have a large amount of lignite coal generation, but it's also because we have a large potential for renewables, both solar and wind. It's interesting that several of the states with the lowest change percentages are also among the largest percentage coal generators or producers. So Iowa, for instance, is very low, between the smallest percentage, 11 and 20%, but Iowa is the 16th largest coal generator in the United States. Wyoming is the home of the Powder River Basin, which produces 40% of the coal burned in the U.S., and yet it's very low. Indiana, second largest coal producer in the U.S., and again, very low requirement, very low change. Kentucky, sixth in the U.S., and also very low. And then West Virginia produces 93% of its power with coal, and yet you can see the reduction is only 11 to 20%. But remember, these reduction percentages are based not only on what's there, but based on the opportunity to reduce these emissions. But all of the states that you see, the light ones, the ones I just mentioned, and the ones in the gray or the light blue, those are all less than 20%. Okay, so let's move on to see what effect that's going to have on coal, because I said we would do that earlier, and here we are. This is the Energy Information Administration's estimate of the amount of coal retirements that we'll have over the next, up through 2040. And we'll talk about those years in just a second. But they project that almost 20% of the coal capacity will be retired by or shortly after the date that MATS becomes effective, or the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard becomes effective in 2015 and 2016. And notice that the EIA estimate increased by almost 20,000 megawatts between their 2013 forecast and their 2014 forecast. Less than a year, really, for that change. That's a significant change. Most of the coal plants that are going to be retired are small, less than 200 megawatts or so, and they're typically older, and it making it uneconomic to retrofit them with expensive new emissions equipment that are required to meet MATS. As an aside here, emissions control equipment is not totally based on the size of the plant. It's entirely possible. It's more based on layout of the plant. So it's entirely possible that a 100 megawatt coal plant emission control system would be about the same price as a 500 megawatt emission control system for a power plant. So it's not based strictly on size. So these small plants really are, though, at a disadvantage. It doesn't get cheaper as they get smaller. If anything, it stays, it remains pretty expensive. Well, while this chart shows retirements through 2040, only really the first 5 years or so are meaningful, in my view. Because we know that we're going to have MATS, and we know that we're going to have some sort of CO2 control during those early years. But I expect the retirements, the coal retirements, to increase further if these carbon pollution standards for existing plants are finalized in any form that's at all like what's being proposed today. Now, let's turn to ERCOT. These are the coal. Remember, we said that somewhere around 20% of the coal units nationwide were going to retire. These are due to MATS, the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard. These are the net retirements in ERCOT over the next several years, the next 10 years or so. And you can see it's only 3%. And that 3% consists of 2 units at CPS Energy, Dealey 1 and Dealey 2, total of 840 megawatts. They're scheduled to retire sometime after the peak of 2018. There's another project called the Texas Clean Energy Project that is a 240 megawatt coal plant. Again, this is a coal plant that will have, or will be designed to have, the CO₂ removal equipment in West Texas. Use CO₂ for oil recovery. So if you net those out, it's really just a 600 megawatt impact due to MATS. I suspect that the Dealey units will retire prior to 2018 because of MATS, because they've only got until 2016 to comply with MATS. So I think those retirements are likely to come a little earlier. So while the losses in capacity are much greater nationally than in ERCOT, the growth in electric demand in ERCOT has been higher than the national average, so the impact could be larger. Well, how will these losses in capacity be made up, and what power sources will replace the lost coal capacity in the U.S. and ERCOT, as well as supply the new demands, the increased demand for energy that we have in this country? Well, we're going to take a look at that, but first let's take a look at what's going on in worldwide solar PV capacity. And this chart shows from 2000 to 2013 PV capacity. It's not important, I don't think, to look at each particular color in this bar, but let me just mention a couple. Overall, the compound annual growth rate is 43%. That's astounding. That is just astounding. China has almost a 70% compound average growth rate for solar. So the growth in solar, it's nothing short of an explosion worldwide. This is the U.S., this is 2013. This is not a forecast. This is actually what happened in 2013. This is the addition of new capacity across the U.S. Natural gas took the lead. You might expect that because of the shale gas boom. But solar was 22% of the new electric capacity additions, trailing only gas and significantly ahead of other renewables. 75% of these solar additions were in California and 10% in Arizona, so it's really confined pretty much to those 2 states, although there obviously is development elsewhere. And nationally, the prospects for solar continue to look very positive through 2040, based on the based on the EIA projections. And these are those projections for renewables. Now, this does not include other sources, so let's be careful there. Solar power leads the growth in renewable capacity between now and 2040, increasing from less than 8 gigawatts, or 8,000 megawatts in 2012 to more than 48,000 megawatts, or 48 gigawatts in 2040. Wind and hydro remain larger in total terms than solar, but the solar growth rate is higher at almost 7% on a compound annual basis. So renewables are forecast to play a somewhat greater role in meeting the nation's electric demands over the next 25 years or so. Now, let's look at the capacity situation before we get too excited about the future of solar. I think we should be excited about it, but let's compare the EIA projections for all sources through 2040, and you can see that on this chart. Although coal declines, it remains the second largest source behind natural gas. And while the compound annual growth rate for gas looks large, it's about 1.3%, compared with almost 7% for solar. And will the shale gas boom continue and support this growth in gas generation? Will gas prices remain reasonable? Well, only time will tell. If gas doesn't grow as expected, either due to availability or price, and coal declines even further, which is entirely possible, renewables, and specifically wind and solar, will be the most likely to step into that gap, into that breach. Now let's get a little closer to our Texas home here. Let's look at new ERCOT capacity. This comes from the ERCOT Capacity Demand Reserve Report. And so while the national picture for solar is rosy, the situation in ERCOT appears to be less so. This chart shows the approved additions of capacity in ERCOT over the next 5 years. Wind and gas far exceed other sources, and even coal exceeds solar. This is that 240 megawatt Texas Clean Energy project in West Texas, the coal item that is. The solar numbers could be a bit misleading, and probably are a bit misleading, as it takes less time to build new solar PV than the other sources. And so applications to ERCOT will likely be much closer to the operation date than for these other technologies. Similar to wind, solar only requires an interconnection permit from ERCOT, whereas gas and coal also require an air permit, which takes a good bit longer to apply for and receive. And so while it's likely that most of the gas capacity that you see here will be built, and probably more than is shown here, I suspect that not all the wind will be built. Given the technological changes and the cost, even the small amount of coal here, 240 megawatts, could be problematic. It may be built. It's got to have a carbon capture system, and again, these systems are at best very new and more likely experimental. Well, while this is the best information I have, the situation in ERCOT changes rapidly, so the next 5 years could be significantly different than we see here. That's a consultant's waffle there. I apologize for that. Okay. Well, let's move on and look at the capacity situation. Well, let's look at the solar capacity plan before we look at absolute capacity. This is where we are, where we have been, and where we are with solar and ERCOT. And again, these are only the actual and the planned projects are the ones that have received all the necessary approvals to begin construction. So there's about 200 megawatts of new solar that will be built sometime between 2014 and 2016. And these are projects, again, that have been approved. There are certainly other projects that have not received approval and should increase these numbers, especially in 2016 and beyond. And recall that the approval process and construction timeframes for solar are relatively short. And so projects more than 2 years out or so are likely not to have applied for approval yet. So solar should continue to play a larger role in the ERCOT landscape. But the shale gas boom and gas generation will take center stage for some time to come. Solar development could be advanced if the state would implement a solar renewable portfolio standard, but it's been reluctant to do so to this point. Now let's look at the resource adequacy issue in ERCOT as it's been a very active issue, and that's to say the least, for the last couple of years. The question has been how to incent the build of necessary capacity, especially peaking capacity, when power prices and gas prices are so low. So let's look at that capacity situation. This is a kind of a complicated chart. I apologize for that at front. It really shows three different capacity demand reserve reports put out by ERCOT. And it says May 2012 at the top, but actually the blue lines are December 2012. I apologize for that as well. So ERCOT issues this capacity demand reserve report twice each year, in December and in May or June, in advance of the winter and in advance of the summer. So at the end of 2012, this is the blue bars, the reserve situation looked pretty bleak, falling substantially below the target of 13.75% reserves by the summer of 2014, this summer. The PUC had been studying the resource adequacy issue since the fall of 2011. As you recall, the summer of 2011 was the hottest on record. We were on the right on the edge with respect to our capacity situation in ERCOT. We didn't have any brownouts or blackouts, but we came close. Power prices were too low to incent new generation. The PUC was seriously considering changing the ERCOT market from an energy-only market, which it is today, to a capacity market similar to what exists in other places like PJM or the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland interconnection up in the Northeast. And so that debate went on. Generators favored a capacity market. Obviously, it meant more revenue for them, but consumers knew who would pay the bill, and so they have typically been opposed. The situation, the capacity situation, as you can see, has improved dramatically in the last 2 years, with reserve margins above the target until 2018, and really pretty close to the target even in 2018. So why is that? Well, a large change is due to new natural gas projects. We thought that natural gas projects were not economic to build, but there are a number of being built. And also a refinement in the way ERCOT projects system demand requirements. And so it's a two-pronged effort. More resources came into the picture, and the forecast, ERCOT's forecast for what would be needed in the future was reduced somewhat. And it's also impacted, these studies have been impacted by the lower summer peaks we've experienced in 2012, 2013, and likely this year in 2014. So let's look at that real quickly here. This is the ERCOT peak load. 2014 is to date. That's a 65,550 megawatt roughly in 2014. That's the last bar. The 68,294 was summer of 2011, hottest summer on record. And you can see every year since then has been lower than that. In fact, if this summer stays where it is, and it's likely we may have, if we have some 100-degree days over the next few weeks, it's likely that peak may rise. It's very doubtful that it would rise to the 68,294, but I guess anything is possible. So this is partially responsible. These lower peaks are partially responsible for the increase in the reserve margin in these years and in the ERCOT projections. So ERCOT looks at this and it says, okay, since the loads are lower in the last, or peaks are lower in the last few years, maybe we should adjust our forecast peaks down a bit, and that's at least part of what has happened. Now let's look at a little bit more about new capacity or adequacy of capacity. This chart is kind of a complicated chart, and it illustrates how much cumulative new capacity has to be built in ERCOT to maintain a 13.75% reserve margin. And this uses, the numbers used here are the ERCOT's projections for the peak load during these years, and their projections for how much in the way of resources will be available. So this is the gap between what we have and what we need to get to 13.75. Recall from the previous slide, or you may not, but in a previous slide, about 12,000 megawatts of new capacity, mostly wind, has received approval to be in service by 2019, 12,000 megawatts. Just the new gas capacity by 2019, which is over 3,500 megawatts, will exceed the new capacity needed in 2019. And you can see that clearly here. And as you may recall, my view is that there will be more gas capacity, new gas capacity built than was shown on that more than that 3,500 megawatts. So it appears that the reserve margin situation in ERCOT won't be an issue for the foreseeable future, even if a substantial amount of currently planned wind and approved capacity is not built. Again, primarily wind. This may not be good news for solar, but on the other hand, it could be, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The following slides are from a previous webinar, but they're worth looking at again as they show the enormous potential for solar power in Texas. And if you've seen these before, you know, you've got to be, this is remarkable stuff. This information is based on a National Renewable Energy Lab study that was done a couple of years ago, I guess now. And what it shows is that in rural areas of Texas, just the rural areas, not the urban areas, we have the potential for 20,000 gigawatts. That's 20 million megawatts of solar PV. That's about 300 times the current capacity in ERCOT. We have 75,000 megawatts capacity in ERCOT. This is 300 times that. And that's not a mistake. It's 300 times the current capacity in ERCOT. So the rural solar PV potential in Texas is higher than any other state, higher than Arizona, higher than New Mexico, higher than California, higher than any other state. So it appears to me, at least, that there's a significant advantage in being large and having lots of sunshine, at least as far as solar PV is concerned. Now, if you took the urban PV, which is relatively small, and added it in, you'd come up with a little over 20,000 gigawatts or 20 million megawatts. If you just took 1% of this potential and developed it with 1% of this potential, the solar PV capacity in the state would exceed 200 gigawatts, or about 3 times the all-time ERCOT peak load. Just 1% of the potential. So if the focus of the PUC and the legislature turns away from the resource adequacy issue that's been at the forefront for the last couple of years and toward the wealth of renewable opportunity in Texas, the news for solar could in fact be very, very good. Well, in summary, I conclude that coal generation is down but not out. Gas generation is up due to environmental issues and the shale gas boom. Renewables, especially wind and solar, are blowing stronger and shining more brightly than they have before. The capacity situation in ERCOT has improved substantially, but the debate about a capacity market and the level of reserves needed presses on. And finally, the solar potential in Texas is enormous, but largely ignored to this point. That concludes my presentation. So, Rick, questions?
Thank you very much, Ron. And I remind the audience again, if you could please chat your question, the lower right corner. You can send it to panelists if you want Ron to answer a question, or you can send it to all participants if you want to share your question with the entire audience. And I'll take those as they've come in order. Ron, the first question was from Richard. How does ERCOT track solar capacity associated with distributed generation that is behind the meter residential and commercial users?
As far as I know, they don't. ERCOT's responsibility is for two things: to operate the transmission system or the delivery system in ERCOT, and to make sure there are adequate resources. So their responsibilities, and to operate the market. Their responsibilities are essentially twofold: to ensure the reliability of the electric power system in Texas, and secondly, to operate a market system for buying and selling power. So those are their two responsibilities, and as far as I know, they have no, well, they may have some interest in, but they really don't deal much in the behind-the-meter PV. Now, over time, they likely will, because, or they'll have to, because if you get more distributed PV or more behind-the-meter PV, it's certainly going to affect the demand on the system. And so, in that regard, they do take into account in their demand calculation, their demand projections, some amount of resources that are essentially demand-side management resources. So that's the way they would look at these: demand-side management, conservation, and things of that nature. But again, their two responsibilities are reliability and operating the market, which really don't relate to all that much to the behind-the-meter PV.
Okay. The next question was from Paul. Does the ERCOT reserve margin projections, does it take into account the demand reduction estimated from efficiency gains?
Well, yeah. Again, that's sort of somewhat the same question, stated a little differently. Yeah, they do as part of their projections, and again, they have a fairly complicated process for developing projected demand, but that is certainly one of them. I mean, they look at weather, they look at history, they look at all sorts of issues, anything that can affect demand. So certainly, demand-side management issues would be something they look at. But again, those issues, so to this point, have been relatively small, and just like solar, which is relatively small in the state, it really hasn't gotten a lot of attention because of that. It will, as you may recall, in the CO₂ regulation, the proposed EPA CO₂ regulation for existing plants, the second one we looked at, the states will have the opportunity to decide how they're going to reduce CO₂ emissions. And one of the key ways they can do that is through efficiency, demand-side reduction, and so that, at that point, I think ERCOT will take a closer look. They do include this, I'm sure. I mean, I don't know the details of their analysis, but they do include items like demand-side management and efficiency in their calculations.
Excellent. The next question is from Dan. With the expected decrease in coal generation and a very low capacity value of only 15% given to wind generation, do you see ERCOT becoming over-reliant on natural gas?
That's a good question. That is a real good question. You know, in my experience in this business, we've tended to go back and forth. Too much reliance on one fuel source and not enough on another. My view is that we ought to rely on a whole portfolio of resources and not be confined to one. But nonetheless, we are moving strongly toward gas. We always have had a lot of gas in this gas generation in this state, but we're moving more strongly in that direction. I do think we will be much more reliant on natural gas than we have been in the past. I don't know that there's any other choice in the matter. We are also reasonably heavily reliant on wind. You know, we've got about somewhere on the order of 11,000 megawatts of wind in this state, which is 16% of our total generating capacity. And I would argue a little bit with the 15% capacity factor. I think actually in West Texas it is probably going to be closer to 25, and on the coast maybe as much as 35. And really a lot of projects are now being built down on the coast where the wind blows more constantly day and night and season to season. So there is going to be more reliance on natural gas, and I believe on wind, hopefully a little bit on solar as well, because it certainly is synergistic with load. But to say that we're going to be over reliant on gas, I guess some could conclude that, but I don't know that we have any choice. We can't build coal. Nuclear appears to be either a long ways off or too expensive, and so I think it's unlikely that we'll see nuclear power plants being built in any jurisdiction where you have a market situation. So where the nuclear plants are being built today is in the southeast, where they can get construction work in progress, or that is they can get some return on their investment while they're building the plant. Can't do that in a competitive market like Texas. So nuclear is really not in the equation. Coal is pretty much out of the equation, but at least for the time being, until technology improves. And so we really are faced for a controllable resource. We're faced with just natural gas, and then we've got the uncontrollable resources, or the less controllable resources, like wind and solar, that can fill in the gaps. And I think they'll play a significant role, but gas is going to be king for quite some time.
All right, very good. The next one is from Auhania. It is about Texas's great solar potential. Will policy instruments be required for solar to take off in Texas in rural areas, or do you think that grid-scale solar will become competitive on price soon?
Oh, gosh, I think grid-scale solar is going to be competitive soon. I really do. You know, the prices are coming down for the equipment, for the panels particularly, pretty rapidly. There are certainly new materials that are being developed that are even more efficient and even cheaper to construct. So I think you'll continue to see at least the panel prices come down. The construction prices are not going to come down quite as rapidly, but I think it's very difficult to conclude anything but PV is going to be competitive with existing resources. Existing resources are going to do nothing, in my view, except get more expensive, and so that and solar is getting cheaper in a big way. So yeah, I think solar is not going to need to be subsidized very soon. Now, it would be nice from a development standpoint if the state would pay a little bit more attention, that is the legislature or the PUC or both, to solar and adopt some sort of a renewable portfolio standard that spoke to solar, that benefited solar. I think that would allow it to take off a lot more rapidly. But even without that, even without subsidies, I believe that solar PV, especially in a place like Texas, where we have the transmission infrastructure, we have the sun, we have the need, we have the load that we need to serve, I think solar is going to play a big role in the next, well, for the foreseeable future, but certainly be competitive from a cost standpoint within just a very few years.
Excellent. The next question is from Richard. How can we get the PUC to consider and take a stronger look at distributed generation rooftop solar?
Well, again, the PUC doesn't have all that much jurisdiction over that. The PUC has jurisdiction over ERCOT, and again, ERCOT has jurisdiction over the reliability of the transmission grid or the delivery system in ERCOT. Well, reliability, first of all, of the electric system, and then operating the market. So what we're going to have to do is come up with some, and the PUC can do this, I suppose, probably have to do it via the legislature, but come up with some sort of a portfolio standard that would provide more incentive for those. But to recognize them, the distributed solar or the rooftop solar will be recognized, but it'll be recognized as a demand-side reduction and not specifically, I don't believe, as a solar reduction. So they'll tend to take a look at all forms that reduce demand, reliability, efficiency, solar, wind, whatever reduces the customer's demand will be factored into ERCOT's analysis going forward. But in terms of ERCOT or the PUC doing anything other than coming up with a renewable portfolio standard for both utility scale and rooftop solar, I'm not sure that there's anything that they can be convinced to do. And really, the portfolio standard today is what we need.
Okay, next question is from Paul. Is there an opportunity in ERCOT to load balance with renewables, such as wind and solar, along with gas, so that the CREZ lines are more fully used and a real power contract could be linked to renewables? And comment was PPAs are actually energy purchase agreements.
Well, that's a long question, but okay, let me do the best I can with that. Well, certainly solar is synergistic with load. It tends, at least in the summertime, to produce, well, it does produce more power than wind does in the daytime. And so the CREZ lines, while they're designed to transport wind energy to markets from the wind areas to the markets, the big cities, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, the solar potential is basically in the same place, maybe a little farther west, as the wind potential. So those CREZ lines, by and large, a lot of those CREZ lines will serve solar as well, and could be used to transmit a good bit of solar when the wind is not blowing. Again, remember, out in West Texas, wind capacity factors are around 25%. So there's a lot of times that those transmission lines are not fully utilized, and it's usually when the sun is shining. And so that's a good time for solar to step in. If solar became a bigger player, however, either through a renewable portfolio standard or just because of economic development, that is the development of new solar projects because they're economical, the PUC likely would pay attention to that just like they did to wind and develop some sort of a process to ensure that there is adequate transmission to move that solar power to market. But again, until you get a substantial amount of a resource, in the case of wind it was 1,000, maybe even a couple of thousand megawatts before anybody noticed what was going on. Today in ERCOT we've got substantially less than 1,000 megawatts of less than 500 megawatts of solar, and so it's not going to get the notice. So, but if it gets larger, and it will, then I think it will attract some notice. So that would allow some synergy. Now, can you create a contract? That's an interesting question. Can you create a power purchase agreement that would essentially, I think the question was, would firm up the power, so it would be equivalent to power from a combined cycle unit? Well, that's going to be a little bit more problematic because you cannot guarantee that the sun will be shining or the wind will be blowing, and so it's difficult to create contracts like that. If there was, if you could bundle solar, wind, and with some renewable, with some controllable resource like a quick start combustion turbine, then yes, then you have a fixed or a marketable firm source that you could sell, but probably only up to the capacity level of the peaking unit, of the gas peaking unit. So right now I think it's problematic to have a firm PPA for solar or for wind simply because they're not controllable and the risks would be way too high.
Okay, well, there's a follow-up question on a comment you had. Why did you say that that a renewable portfolio standard is the policy needed in Texas versus feed-in tariffs or rebates or production credits anything like that?
Oh, well, I mean, there's lots of ways you could do that. I mean, I just use that as a generality. Really, all of those other than all of those feed-in tariffs, that sort of, they are just mechanisms to reach a renewable portfolio standard. My view is that we need some sort of a goal to shoot at in ERCOT. Right now, you could argue that we have a 500 megawatt goal for solar, but really that goal in our renewable portfolio standard in ERCOT, that goal is 500 megawatts of anything but wind. So you know, it can be hydro, it can be anything. So what we need is a renewable portfolio standard that says, okay, by 2020, we're going to have 3,000 megawatts of PV in or solar in ERCOT, and then you can use feed-in tariffs or any number of mechanisms to make that happen. But that's what we need. We need the goal first, and then the mechanism to achieve that goal can follow.
Okay. The next question was from Dan. With the investment tax credit expiring in 2016, that's the 30% federal ITC, do you expect a lot of solar projects to ask for interconnection in ERCOT, like what happened at wind with respect to the PTC, production tax credit expiration?
Well, yeah, you know, I expect a lot of projects in ERCOT to, I expect the growth in projects in ERCOT to accelerate. Not strictly because of that. I mean, that will have some impact, but I think you'll see the acceleration because there is the availability, there's the potential, and the prices or the cost of building solar is becoming more and more competitive all the time. So there are going to be a number of factors, but I think, yes, there will be an acceleration of solar. It will be helped along by people trying to get out in front of the investment tax credit. And, you know, the history, as I'm sure you know, the history of the investment tax credit has been an on and off type thing. And so it's very likely that investment tax credit may be renewed after 2016. It may not, but it's likely that it will. And especially with our emphasis, our de-emphasis in coal and our increased emphasis on renewables and on emission-free technology. So, you know, I think it's very likely that 2016 won't be the hard stop with regard to investment tax credits or other incentives. I think it'll just, you have to put an end time on these things, and that, as we've seen with the wind, it's come and gone and come and gone and come and gone a number of times, but it remains in place today. So I think you'll see, well, I say it remained in place largely through the period of time development of wind, and I think you'll see the same thing with solar.
Okay, the next question is from Albert. How does storage integrate into more solar? And so I would imagine he's talking about utility scale energy storage. And one comment for Albert, we will be posting on the Principal Solar Institute probably in about a week. Our next webinar, beginning of October, will have the president of the Energy Storage Association will be giving an overview of exactly this topic. So I'll let Ron answer it briefly, and then we'll have a full hour on it next month.
Boy, does that put pressure on me. Well, you know, I'll just tell you what I'm sure you've already heard, that really the holy grail for renewables is storage. If we can figure out how to implement large storage, that really makes wind a lot more valuable, and it makes solar a lot more valuable as well. This is the type of thing that would, you know, I mentioned earlier that you can firm up a contract with a controllable generation resource like a peaking unit, a gas-fired peaking unit. Well, storage will do the same thing. It will, in fact, it may be even better because you can probably control it more, or it can move more rapidly. So storage is the holy grail. The problem we've got is, what is storage going to be? Is it going to be compressed air energy storage, which has been largely unsuccessful? There are a couple of projects and a couple more being talked about, but basically it's been around for a long time and really hasn't developed into much. Is it going to be batteries? You know, we've got a 32 megawatt battery storage unit out in West Texas. at no trees, that is significant, but it's 32 megawatts. You know, that's 10 wind turbines. And if you've been to West Texas anytime lately, you know, there's a lot more than 10 wind turbines out there. So it's a matter of scale. If you could get enough storage, though, at a reasonable cost in a reasonable location, then yes, it would definitely benefit renewables. And again, it is the holy grail, but we're a long ways, I believe, a long ways away from that, simply because it takes up a lot of space, and right now it's pretty expensive to build anything of any size at all. And we need a lot of size in the utility world, with a peak of in this state of 68,000 megawatts. That's a long ways from 32 megawatts of battery storage and no trees.
Excellent. Next question is from Randall. What is your recommendation for financing merchant solar or any new generation projects without a long-term PPA in ERCOT?
Well, I'd say the chances of financing a solar project without a PPA are pretty low. I don't know who's going to loan you the money to do that. You know, the only thing I can think of would be if you could find some private equity that was willing to take a chance on the market price being sufficient to support a solar project. That would be one way. But you know, frankly, without a power purchase agreement, it's going to be very difficult with the power prices we currently have in Texas to support the financing or the debt repayment for a solar project. That's even true today for natural gas projects, although a few have been built. Just real quick, because this is a mechanism that's been used. Panda Energy is building a couple of combined cycle gas plants. They were unable to get PPAs for these plants, and so what they did is they did a study and determined that 4 years out that the power prices in ERCOT are likely to be sufficient to support debt service on those power plants. And so that what they did is they bought a put option that will guarantee the payment of the debt until that point, until 4 years out. And this is I mean, it's more complicated than this, but this is just very high level look. So that's kind of a unique way to finance it. It's possible that you might be able to do something like that, but you'd have to convince someone that the power prices 4 years out are going to be able to service the debt, or some period out are going to be able to service the debt, and then you'd have to provide some bridge financing between now and then. So difficult prospect at best without a PPA at this point.
And I'll chat into the chat area for Randall a post that we had on First Solar's project in Barilla, West Texas, where they are building a 22-megawatt solar farm without a PPA, effectively at spec. They have some advantage in that they have a lot of panels coming off their own production line, and they need to have a source for those, and so they decided to do that. Outside of some unique situation like that, I think Ron's described the difficulties very well. And again, that's only 22 megawatts out of the gigawatts that we'd like to build.
Yeah, if you can find some situations like that where a panel manufacturer is basically giving away their panels, or where you know, there's some other unique circumstance that reduces the cost. It's basically how much does it cost? How are you going to service the debt is really the cost, and there's really the issue. And if the power prices don't do it, then there has to be something else there to do it. And it's either got to be lower construction cost, that is, you've got less in it, so you need less in the way of power prices to service that debt, or it's got to be some direct contribution or some, again, some unique financing strategy. And there are those out there, but you know, very difficult. I haven't seen any solar projects that have been financed like the Panda Energy projects have been. So, and I don't think there will be, but there could be. It's